I've been confessing the last couple weeks that I am directionally challenged, and it's funny because I say that, and what I've heard like from some people is like, you can't be that bad, and yeah, I can. It's true. I'm worse than people think. Here's another example. Years ago, I was training for a running race, an ultramarathon. It was a trail race, and it's like a 50-mile race, and so there's a lot of running involved. And at one point, the race is on the Superior Hiking Trail, so it goes from basically south of Duluth all the way up to Canada, essentially. And so, in training for this, I drove up to the trail and hopped on at one point. I was going to have this really like hours and hours long run. So I ran out on the trail. It's a really simple trail. Like, it's super simple. Like, it's just you get on it, and it just goes one direction. And then you can turn around and it goes the other direction. It's not complicated. I got on this trail and I ran like 2 hours into the trail. And I was like, okay, time to turn around. So I turned around, started running back. And at one point I was like, I'm feeling pretty good. And I saw this little thing, like it's called a spur. It's like the thing goes off the trail to like a lookout of some sort. And I thought, I feel good. I'm gonna take the little scenic overlook, take a little break, take in the view. So I did that, walked back, ran back to the trail, to the main trail. And I got there and I was like, wait, do I go left or do I go right? Like, I have the memory of a gnat. Like, it's just like, I had no idea. And you would think, it's so simple. Did you take a right to get onto the spur? In which case, take a right to get, so I got on the trail, I started running, and I thought, I think this is the way home. And then I saw my tracks, and I was like, oh, those my tracks going both ways? Because that means that I'm going the wrong way. So I turned around and went the other way. And then I saw another set of tracks that were like, were they mine? And so I kept running back and forth. Finally, I had to like just give up and like, I'm just gonna run in this direction. I hope that I can get home. The frustration, like I don't want to say the terror, but the desperation of how simple is this? A, I could have just remembered, yeah, take a right. B, I had one of two choices. That's it. Like, there's only two options. But that was part of the problem too. The problem was, if I made the wrong choice, every step, I just kept thinking, every step is taking me further away from where I need to be. And so that was that desperation. Like, every moment, every step, if I'm going the wrong direction, if I'm lost, every step is taking me further from where I need to be. And I think probably a lot of us know this feeling, like whether you're driving before GPS or if you don't have GPS, it's one of those things like, I think I'm heading to my friend's house, but I don't know because I could be driving, and every minute I'm driving is taking me further away from where I need to be. You know, this series we started a couple weeks ago called Lost is I think one of the hard things about being lost is the not knowing. One of the hard things about being lost is I don't know, am I on the right path? And if I am on the right path, am I going in the right direction on the right path? And I think it's many of us. I think so for so many of us, the pain comes from not knowing. And so the thing we want when we're lost, the thing we want when it comes to God's call in our life is I just want to know, right? So if we're a Christian, you know this. If you're a Christian, you know that God has a call in your life. He made you on a purpose. He made you on purpose. He made you for a purpose. That there's a vocation. That God has. He has a will in mind for you and for your life. And so for a lot of us, we're just like, okay, I just need to know what that is. And if I knew what that was, I just need to know. If I knew what that was, then I'd be okay. And I think for a couple reasons, it's not bad, because one is like, I don't want to miss it. And the other is because if I'm on the wrong path, if I'm going the wrong direction, then every step is taking me further from where I need to be. And I know this desperation, I know this panic so well. Like when I first encountered Jesus in a way that like changed my life, I realized pretty quickly that God might be calling me to be a priest, but He might be calling me to be married. And so I remember the prayer that defined every one of my prayers from when I was 15 years old until I was 23 or 20, whatever it was, God, just tell me what you want me to do. That was it. That was my prayer. It's just, God, tell me what you want me to do. Like, I remember saying even like this, I don't care what it is. Just tell me. Now, you might be in the same position. You might say, actually, but I do care what it is. But I thought I was so open, like, all I just want is I just want to know. And if I know, then I'll be fine. And again, you might be in that place because we talked about this a couple times already, that if you know God, you know you can trust Him, right? If you know that God knows you better and loves you better than you know and love yourself, then okay, I know that He's good. I know I can trust Him. And if you know that, you know His promise. It's the promise that God made back in Jeremiah chapter 29. There's this promise that God makes to the people of Israel. Now, at this point, they are far from the promised land. They've been exiled in Babylon, and Jeremiah is speaking to them, and he speaks these words in Jeremiah chapter 29. that God still hasn't forgotten you, that God still has a plan for you, that God still has a promise for you. And he says this, he says, very clearly, he says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans for your welfare, not for your woe. Plans for a future full of hope. Like, this is the promise. This is the promise of God. That's a promise of a future full of hope. But here's the problem. That's the promise. The problem is, where most of us live is that space between the promise and the promised land. Because, here's Jeremiah, who makes it very, very clear. No, God has a promise for you. Don't worry about it. He's promised you, he's told you exactly what's going to happen. What's going to happen is he's going to bring you home. But they weren't home yet. They had to live in that space between the promise and the promised land. And he said, but I'm promising you, though, a future full of hope. That's why I love the second reading today. It's the first letter of St. Paul to the Thessalonians. We just shifted away. Last weekend was Philippians, and now we just are starting to read from Thessalonians. And as St. Paul's writing to those Christians in Thessalonica, he says this. He says something he thanks God about. He says, I thank God for your work in faith, for your labor of love, and for your endurance in hope. Because those Christians also, they had to walk in hope. The Christians, they also, just like all of us, they had to walk in that space between the promise and the promised land. And so what Paul is saying is, not just you have hope, he's saying you have endurance and hope. Which means you have to hope for a long time. Which means that's hard. I mean, to think about, endurance is actually connected to that cardinal virtue of fortitude. And one of the elements of the cardinal virtue of fortitude is this gift of virtue of perseverance. Endurance and perseverance are kind of the same thing. And what endurance is, the endurance and hope, what perseverance is, its definition is, it is choosing the good despite difficulty or delay. So Paul tells the Thessalonians, you're living between the promise and the promised land, and you're living this with endurance and hope. What you're doing is you're continuing to choose the good despite difficulty or delay. And I think that's where we are. Because we would like to know. We don't know yet. So we have this fear of, so is there a hope? Is there going to be a promised land? Am I going in the right direction? Or is every step taking me further away from where I need to be? Here's the thing that's great news. I think it's really great news. Is that if you're a Christian, if you realize that, okay, God's involved in this and God's involved in your life, regardless of what you're doing, a life surrender to God means this, that God can use it all. That if your life is given to God, then God uses it all. If he uses every step. So what I mean by that is, if you're a Christian and you're like, God, I'm taking every step. I don't know necessarily where you're leading me. I don't even necessarily know how to get unlost. I don't know how to get to where you want me to go because I don't know where you want me to go. But every step I know you can use. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but how do I do this? Well, go back to the 3 questions we've mentioned in the last 2 weekends. The 3 questions of, am I in a state of grace? Am I doing my daily tasks? And did I pray today? Now, that's not oversimplifying things. I think we overcomplicate things. In fact, sometimes people think like, oh my gosh, following the Lord is so complicated. Christianity is very, very straightforward. It's very, very simple. It comes down to those 3 questions. Am I in a state of grace? If I'm not, get in a state of grace by going to confession. Am I doing my daily tasks? If not, just simply start doing them. And am I praying? Do I have a relationship with Jesus that's lived on a regular basis? If not, just start talking to the Lord. Start letting him speak to you. If we do those things, we realize then God can use all of it. If we do those things, we realize that there's no such thing as a wasted step. That every step is bringing us closer to where we need to be. And again, we come back to this place of like, yeah, but if I just knew, and that's the thing is like, but if I just knew that call, if I just knew that purpose, if I just knew that vocation, then I'd be fine. I get it, but I doubt it. Like I understand, but I don't think that's true. And here's why I don't think it's true. I think it's not true because I was there at one point saying, God, just let me know. But here's the problem. God is always on time. What I mean by that is he is never too late, but he's also never too early. And he's never too early because he knows our hearts. In fact, we had a student here years ago, and he was in the position I was in where he just wanted to know. He just wanted to know what God wanted him to do. And so he did one of those things where he made one of those deals with God. And I do not recommend this, but this is what sometimes people do. When they're desperate, this is what they do. They say, okay, God, give me a sign. And his discernment was like mine. His discernment was, should I be married or should I be a priest? And that's not everyone's call, but that's what he was in that place of discernment. And he said, okay, God, if you want me to be married, give me this sign. And if you want me to be a priest, give me this sign. And again, I'm like, dude, don't do that. Because A, God always speaks in clarity. He rarely speaks through signs. So but here's the thing. No one listens to me. I give advice and no one cares. So he does this and he gets the quote unquote sign that says, hey, dude, you're supposed to be a priest. And this guy, he went into the worst tailspin I've ever seen of anyone because he was like, no, I'll take it. I don't care what it is. I just want to know. And then God, quote unquote, let him know. And it was like the world had ended. It was the worst season in his life. We had to undo all these things because he thought all I need to do is if I just knew, I'd be fine. And then he had some degree of certainty, he thought, and he wasn't fine because that's not the key. The key is not just knowing. Because God will never be too late in revealing to any of us what he wants us to do, but he also will never be too early. He always waits until our hearts have been prepared. And we're living here between the promise and the promised land. I think about this. Remember when the Jews were delivered from slavery in Egypt? They had the promise. God was going to lead them to the promised land. In fact, he led them there and they wouldn't go in and fight. And so he had to lead them through the wilderness. And there's this really remarkable thing that happened. I don't know if you guys caught this in the Bible where it says that there was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That would be over the tabernacle, right? It'd be over the Holy of Holies, it'd be over the place of God's presence. And it was not only a sign of God's presence, but also it was a sign of when it was time to move. In fact, that pillar of cloud would be there, the pillar of fire would be there. But then when it was time for the people of Israel to move, it said the pillar of cloud would rise up, or the pillar of fire would raise up, and they would go. And they would follow after that pillar of cloud. They'd follow after that pillar of fire. But they wouldn't move until the Lord led them. They stayed in the place. As long as that pillar stayed there, they stayed there. Because this is where God wants us to be. But when it was time to move, they simply picked up and moved. The people of Israel were wandering in the desert for 40 years, but they weren't lost. They were being led. And this is what it is to be a Christian right now. Yes, we're living between that promise and the promised land. And we're wandering in the desert, but you're not lost, you're being led. Even with the promise, we can still panic. Now, not only did God say in Jeremiah 25, I'll bring you back from Babylon, but 150 years earlier than this is crazy. We heard it in the first reading. It's Isaiah, book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah even says, before they even went into exile, before they even went to Babylon, 150 years before any of this stuff happened, Isaiah prophesies that there's going to be a king, and his name is going to be Cyrus. He's going to be from Persia, and he's going to actually send you back home. And God promised, here's what's going to happen. If you want to know what's going to happen, here's what's going to happen. And yet, they still had to live through siege. They still had to live through the Babylonians. They still had to live through exile. They still had to live in that space between the promise and the promised land, even though they knew. So I think for a lot of us who say, okay, I'm lost. If I just knew, that would be enough. I think for a lot of us, it's not just knowing. It's like, I want to be done. Right? When it comes to like our vocation, our call, our purpose, whatever it is, sometimes it's, yes, I want to know what it is, but sometimes it's just, I want to be there. I don't want to keep being led. I want to be home. I don't want to keep walking. I don't want to keep using every step. I want to have it be over. But the thing is, that's not how life works. That's not how vocation works. That's not how being led by God works. That's not how any of this works. Go back to the Old Testament. In the book of Samuel, there's David. We know the story of David. And David is a kid, right? The prophet Samuel comes to his home and basically tells him his vocation. He tells him, here's what God's call is on your life. You're going to be the next king of Israel. And so there's the young David, this kid, this child, in front of his brothers and his dad. He gets anointed the next king of Israel. What happens after this? He's already got his vocation. The vocation is absolutely clear. The call is completely clear. You are the next king of Israel. And now go back out into the fields and be a shepherd again. And so, like, wait, what? No, I know my vocation. You can imagine David's angst, right? Is like this tension, this frustration over like, but I'm the king. I'm going to be a shepherd again. So he goes back out into the field and what's he do? Well, he's there. Well, he has to fight off some beasts and he plays the lyre, write some songs. At one point, he gets asked to sing songs for King Saul. Imagine he'd go into that courtroom, that palace, whatever it is, and it's like, wait, I'm supposed to be the king. Why am I singing songs for the king? But there he is. Later on, his brothers go off to fight the Philistines, And his dad sends David to go, hey, bring them some food. So basically, he hears David, he could say, like, are you serious? I'm the king. But you're treating me like Uber Eats. Like, that's all I am to you guys. And then later on, what happens? He fights Goliath. But then the king makes him a general. But he's not a general, he's a king. Then after that, we know this story of King Saul, right? He has envy of David. He's jealous of David, and so he tries to hunt him down, and David's on the run. At one point, David goes from being a general of one of Saul's armies to all he can lead is a group of bandits. Like, all the people that can follow David are people who are all just this not good folks. Basically, he's leading the Hell's Angels, kind of a situation where it's just not a bunch of good men, but he's just leading these guys. And you think that all along, every step of the way, David could be looking at his life and saying, what the heck is going on? Like, I know my vocation. I know my call. I know God's call. I know his promise on my life. His promise is that I'll be the next king of Israel. But what is happening? Every step I'm taking is another step further away from being the king. You could contrast the life of David with the life of another king. We know that slightly after David's life was a man named Alexander from Macedonia, Alexander the Great. And kind of like David, Alexander knew from a young age. I mean, he's the son of his father, Philip II, and Philip II was great king, great general. His whole life, he knew what his call was. His whole life, Alexander knew that he was destined to be the next great king. And so he had the greatest teachers. Like, not only did he have his father, King Philip II, who was an incredible military strategist and mastermind, he also had a man named Parmenion. And Parmenion was another trusted general that was incredibly gifted when it came to military tactics. He also had Lysimachus. And Lysimachus was one of his father's bodyguards. And he taught Alexander, like, on a daily basis, he taught Alexander, like, the Greek version of martial arts, right? Not only that, you had Leonidas. And Leonidas was married to, or a relative of Alexander's mom. And he also was a great general. So he's surrounded by all these fighters, all these generals, all these strategists. And not only that, Alexander had as a tutor the philosopher Aristotle. So you can imagine, here's Alexander the Great. And yes, he knows he's going to be the king, but not yet, right? He's not going to take over yet until what? Until he's done with his training. And it becomes so obvious. He has his father and his father's friend, another general. He has a bodyguard. He has Aristotle himself. All these people training Alexander for the next step, for his vocation, essentially, for the call that he has on his life. And it's really obvious that all this is just preparation. All this is training to take the next step. And that's no different than King David. It's just less obvious. David, anointed by the king, anointed as king, sent back out into the field to tend the sheep. Well, while he's in the field, what's he do? A couple things. One is he plays the lyre a lot and sings a lot of songs. That does two things. One is, as we said, that prepares him to go into King Saul's chamber and see, this is what it's like in the kingly courts. This is what it's like to be in the royal court. This is how a royal court works. As he's singing his songs and he's soothing Saul's troubled soul, he's also seeing things. He's learning about, here's what life is like in the court. Not only that, but as he's developing his skill at writing songs and singing songs and playing songs, later on, King David would write so many psalms for the Lord. In fact, the psalm for today's Mass was written by King David 3,000 years ago. And that skill was developed while he was out as a shepherd. Not only that, but also he faced down wild beasts as he defended the sheep. He faced creatures that were more powerful, more cunning, more dangerous than he was. And that prepared him for what? For the next step. When he was sent to bring food to his brothers and he was able to face Goliath, who was more cunning and more powerful and more dangerous than he was. And that prepared him for the next step, right? Which was to be made a general. Learn how to lead men into battle. And that prepared him for what? For when Saul was chasing him and he had to learn how to, imagine trying to lead a band of bandits, like lead a group of this really, really rough men who didn't want to be led. But he developed those skills that he would need later on when he united the 12 tribes of Israel, a group of 12 tribes who didn't want to be led. See, when we look at it through the lens of faith, we realize that God hadn't just given David a vocation and then abandoned him. That God had given David a vocation, given a place, a call in his life, made him for a purpose. He was leading him so that every step of David's life was leading him closer and closer to becoming the person he was called to be. That's what God's doing in your life. That is literally what God is doing in your life. Every step is leading you closer and closer to being the person He's made you to be. And this is the last thing. At the same time, I get it. Here we are on a Sunday, and it is really easy to still feel lost. And it's really easy to still have that thing. But they all knew, all these people, they knew their call. I just want to know, or I just want to be there. I just want to be done. That's why we need what St. Paul writes in his letter to the Thessalonians today. We need this we need this perseverance. We need the ability to choose the good despite difficulty and delay. We need this endurance and hope. And we don't just need it for now. We need it for later. Because here's a question. What do we expect will happen once we get there? What I mean by that is a lot of us are praying for our vocation. Like, what's your plan for my life? God, what's your call in my life? What do we expect is going to happen once we get there? Well, you think, well, then I'll be there. Then I'll be done, right? then it'll be over. No, it will simply be the time for us to move on to the next thing. In that space between the promise and the promised land, what happened when the people of Israel made it to the promised land from the Exodus? Well, they didn't just show up and chill. They arrived at the promised land and they had to fight. But that being led through the wilderness prepared them to fight. When the people of Israel brought back from Babylon in exile, right? Jeremiah was speaking to them and Isaiah was speaking to them. They didn't just walk back to the promised land and hang out. They got back to the promised land and they had to rebuild. What happens when someone says, if I just meet that person? Then you have the difficult work of crafting a life together. What happens when someone says, I just want to have that child? And then, okay, now difficult path of trying to raise a child or become a religious sister or becoming a priest or becoming a consecrated single person. Once we realize that's our vocation, life doesn't end. Life keeps on going. We don't stop walking when we get to that place. The space between the promise and the promised land, that's training for the promised land. But here's the reality. Life in the promised land is still life. And life in your vocation and life in my vocation is still life. And because of that, we will need to keep walking. Every step. Therefore, we need perseverance. We need endurance and hope. And that hope is trust. That hope is confidence. That hope is faith. That hope is the belief that every step you take is doing something. Because every step you take is leading you closer to the person that you're called to be.